from Rutgers University, and the paper is entitled Normativity, Supervenience, and Semantic Determination. Fine.
Thank you. Well, as Laurie just indicated, my title has mentions three topics, and two of them, supervenience and semantic determination, I've thought really long and hard about. But the first one, normativity, I haven't thought much about at all. I work on a lot of different topics. I'm kind of a generalist, but not only have I never written on normativity, I've never taught normativity in a graduate class. In fact, I've never even taught normativity in an undergraduate class. So I'm really outside my comfort zone talking about normativity. And of course, I'm going to run the danger that I may just be, in some cases, reinventing the wheel, and in other cases, making well-known mistakes. So you'll have to take what I say about normativity, and I won't say a lot about it, with a grain of salt. But hopefully, I won't waste your time here today because I'll have enough points to make about the other topics. Okay. By the normative, I mean roughly what falls on the ought side of the ought-is divide, and by the non-normative, what falls on the is side. By a normative claim, I'll mean a claim that contains an essential occurrence, in Quine's sense, of a normative term. The claim that if something is good, then it's good is not a normative claim. The claim that honesty is the best policy is a normative claim. Traditional non-cognitivism implies that 1, normative claims don't express beliefs, and that 2, normative claims are neither true nor false. Now 1 and 2 are, I believe, both false. Thesis 1 is wildly implausible. Even if normative utterances sometimes, or even always, express attitudes other than beliefs, they can express beliefs. I believe that I ought to prepare for my lecture on Tuesday. I believe that lying is wrong. That is, that an act is wrong insofar as it's an act of lying. And I believe that the fact that a razor blade has a very sharp edge is a reason not to run my fingers across it. And these are normative beliefs. In assessing 2, the thesis that normative claims are neither true nor false, consider the following 2 principles. T, if an utterance U means that P, then U is true if and only if P. F, if an utterance means that P, then U is false if and only if not P. By false is meant here not true. The following are instances of these principles respectively. If an utterance U means that lying is wrong, then U is true if and only if lying is wrong. And if an utterance U means that lying is wrong, then U is false if and only if it's not the case that lying is wrong. Now T and F are not exactly right as stated because they fall prey to the liar paradox. But they don't exclude any of the ways anyone has tried to handle that paradox, none of which I believe have been wholly successful. I'm going to set that paradox aside for present purposes and assume that T and F can be qualified in such a way that utterances involving self-reference are cordoned off. So qualified, T and F are, I think, deeply intuitive, which isn't to say they can't be resisted. Let's call utterances that mean that P, for some P, assertions. The principles jointly imply assertion by valence. Every assertion is either true or false. This is an instance of the law of excluded middle. The law of excluded middle is valid in classical logic. I'm sorry, it is if you plug in not true for false. Sorry about that. Now, the law of excluded middle is valid in classical logic and in some non-classical logics, for example, quantum logic. But in many non-classical logics, it's not valid. An instance of the law of excluded middle, however, can't be denied on pain of contradiction in virtually any logic. including intuitionistic logic, Kleene strong three-valued logic, Kleene weak three-valued logic, and relevance logic. These logics thus don't give non-cognitivists what they want. Non-cognitivists want to deny that normative claims are either true or not true. But these logics at best give them only the right to remain silent about whether normative claims are either true or not true. Moreover, it should be noted that even if one holds, say, Kleene weak three-valued logic, which allows that not all claims are either true or false, acceptance of T and F will commit one to assertion by valence, because it will give you T and F sentences. Assertion by valence will follow from T and F, even in Kleene weak three-valued logic, and so as well in Kleene strong three-valued logic. Indeed, from T and F, one can derive the whole of classical logic from the principles of Kleene weak three-valued logic. I'll hereafter assume that 1 and 2 are false. Normative statements can express beliefs and are either true or false. Classical logic earns its keep by serving in conjunction with Zermelo-Fraenkel's set theory as the foundation of classical mathematics, the mathematics that's used throughout the sciences. Perhaps intuitionistic logic is up to the tasks required by science, but scientific practice now deploys classical mathematics, classical logic. Now, there may be reasons to change scientific practice, but here I'll simply deny that considerations about normative discourse, our topic here, provide such reasons. So I'll hereafter assume classical logic, that normative claims are true or false, and that they typically express beliefs. Now, it's nowadays fairly widely recognized that we can hold that normative claims are true or false if we accept a deflationary or weak or disquotational conception of truth. T and F count as deflationary. But some maintain that in an inflationary or strong or naturalistic conception of truth conditions, normative claims are neither true nor false. It's also fairly widely recognized that, or less contentiously, I'm a member of the camp that holds that a deflationist about truth can capture the intuitions of proponents of a naturalistic conception of truth by introducing a semantically determinate operator. Every claim is either true or false, but some claims are neither semantically determinately true nor semantically determinately false. Claims about borderline cases of application of a vague term are familiar examples of claims that are neither determinately true nor determinately false. Suppose that Harry is a borderline bald man. Then, even though, quote, Harry is a bald man is either true or false, it's indeterminate which it is. Quote, Harry is bald is neither determinately true nor determinately false. It's important to keep in mind that the kind of indeterminacy in question is semantic, but it entails epistemic indeterminacy. If it's semantically indeterminate whether P, then it's epistemically indeterminate whether P, since P lacks a determinate truth value. Only determinate truths can be known. The modal logic for the determinately operator is T. The axioms of T are, if it's determinately true that P, then P. And if it's determinately true that if P, then Q, then if it's determinately true that P, then it's determinately true that Q. Logical truths are determinately true, thus it's determinately true that either Harry is bald or it's not the case that Harry is bald. Moreover, if, for instance, Harry is an exemplar of a bald person, then Harry is bald is determinately true. And if Harry is a man with, say, no hairs on his scalp, then Harry is bald is determinately false. But to repeat, if Harry is a borderline bald man, then Harry is bald is neither determinately true nor determinately false. It's a very important feature of the determinately operator D that it doesn't commute with disjunction and doesn't commute with existential generalization. Thus, a disjunction can be determinately true even if neither disjunct is determinately true. And an existential generalization can be determinately true even if no witness for it is determinately true. I'll illustrate failure of commutivity just for disjunction. It's determinately true that either Harry is bald or it's not the case that Harry is bald. But it may fail to be the case that it's determinately true that Harry is bald, and also fail to be the case that it's determinately true that it's not the case that Harry is bald. Now, some leading proponents of the disquotational and so deflationary conception of truth, that should be, for example, Hartree Field, maintain that normative claims are never determinately true or determinately false. They are either true or false. Indeed, it's determinate that they are either true or false. But it's always indeterminate which they are. Field calls normative discourse non-factual discourse. Statements that count as non-factual discourse, it may be claimed, are neither either determinately true or determinately false. A neo-non-cognitivist might embrace a deflationary conception of truth and falsehood, and so allow that normative claims are either true or false, but maintain that they count as non-factual discourse, and so are never determinately true or determinately false. But what's non-factual discourse? One might hold that a claim that P is non-factual if and only if there's no fact of the matter whether P. And one might claim that there's no fact of the matter whether P, just in case it's neither a fact that P nor a fact that not P. One might hold as well that a statement is determinately true if and only if there's a fact that makes it true, and that a statement's determinately false if and only if there's a fact that makes it false. If there's no fact of the matter whether P, then there's no fact that makes a statement that P true, and no fact that makes a statement that P false. And so the statement that P is neither determinately true nor determinately false. Let's formulate this idea in relation to T and F. If an utterance U means that P, then U is determinately true if and only if it's a fact that P. If an utterance U means that P, then U is determinately false if and only if it's a fact that not P. If U counts as non-factual discourse, then U is neither determinately true nor determinately false. The leading idea then is that a neo-non-cognitivist can maintain that normative claims count as non-factual discourse, and so are neither determinately true nor determinately false. Now, I think there's indeed an important difference between truth and falsehood on the one hand, and semantically determinate truth and falsehood on the other. If Harry's a borderline bald person, then even though Harry is bald is either true or false in a deflationary sense, it's neither determinately true nor determinately false. But I myself wouldn't draw the distinction by appeal to whether there's a fact of the matter, at least in the sense of that expression that I've just given. And the reason is that the following principles seem to me to be quite intuitive. PF, it's a fact that P if and only if P. NF, it's a fact that not P if and only if not P. These principles jointly entail that for any P, it's either a fact that P or a fact that not P. Now, if P and F are correct, then on characterizations of determinant truth and determinant falsehood, in terms of whether there is a fact of the matter, as that idea was explicated above, determinate truth collapses to truth, and determinate falsehood collapses to falsehood. Thus, suppose that an utterance U means that P. Then, given T, U is true if and only if P. Given PF, it's a fact that P if and only if P. Thus, U is true if and only if it's a fact that P. So U is true if and only if it's determinately true. And an analogous argument will show that U is false if and only if it's determinately false. Now, of course, one might try to resist PF and NF. Consider PF. It's a fact that P if and only if P. Surely, if it's a fact that P, then P. But one might resist a claim that if P, then it's a fact that P. One wonders, though, what more it would take for it to be a fact that P than just P. If, for instance, lying is wrong, what more would it take for it to be a fact that lying is wrong? Wouldn't it be enough that lying is wrong? Now, there is an ordinary epistemic notion of a fact as something that is known. Thus, some folks say evolution isn't a fact, meaning we don't know whether it's true. But that's not the relevant sense of fact in the debate between cognitivists and non-cognitivists. The relevant notion of fact is metaphysical. It's hard to see what the grounds could be for denying that if lying is wrong, then it's a fact that lying is wrong. Still, one might try to develop a metaphysical theory of facts according to which it's not true that if P, then it's a fact that P. One might, for instance, take facts to be obtaining states of affairs and states of affairs to include properties as constituents, so that facts contain properties as constituents. Whether there are normative facts would then depend on whether there are normative properties. And one might deny that there are normative properties. From the fact that we have normative beliefs, it doesn't follow that there are normative properties. There's a distinction between concepts, ways of thinking of things as being or not being, and properties, ways things might be. Although normative beliefs will have normative concepts as constituents, there may be no normative properties. It might be argued then that there are no normative properties, and so normative facts, and thus that it's not true that if P, then it's a fact that P. It might thus be claimed that there will be no facts of the matter to make normative statements determinately true or determinately false. Now, I think there is indeed a distinction between properties and concepts, and it's a philosophically important one. I myself hold the following non-duplication principle for properties. No two properties can have the same extension in every possible world. I don't, however, hold that non-duplication principle for concepts. Two concepts can have the same extension in every possible world. The concept of water and the concept of H2O provide a familiar example. The concepts are distinct. One can have either concept without having the other, but the concepts have the same extension in every possible world. Two concepts can answer to the same property. But what properties are there then? Properties have been posited to serve a variety of different purposes. They have, for instance, been posited to be the semantic values of meaningful predicates. But they've also been posited by some to be ways things might be that endow them with causal powers. Think, for instance, of Shoemaker's causal theory of properties. And they've been posited to serve other purposes as well. An austere metaphysical theory of properties might take them to be eminent universals, that is, Aristotelian universals, and entail that there are only a handful of them, so that even most of the predicates deployed in the special sciences fail to denote properties, though of course they express concepts. There is, I believe, no one uniform ontological category that will serve all of the purposes in question. But I won't try here to develop a metaphysical theory of properties. I'm just going to assume the following two principles. There's a property F if and only if something can be F. And there's a property not F if and only if something could be not F. Now this is a pleonastic conception of properties. It's a kind of redundancy theory of properties. I'm going to use property in this pleonastic sense rather than trying to develop a metaphysical theory of properties. Also, I will assume PF and NF and thereby embrace a pleonastic conception of fact. So it's kind of redundancy theory of facts. Fact of P if and only P. Saying P and saying it's a fact of P, two ways of saying the same thing. I take it as fairly uncontroversial that there are normative properties and normative facts in these pleonastic senses. That there are normative properties and facts in these pleonastic senses leaves open whether normative claims are ever determinately true or determinately false. In the pleonastic sense of fact, there's trivially always a fact of the matter whether someone is bald. Still, if we embrace a deflationary conception of truth, then we need the distinction between truth and determinate truth. It's either the case that Harry is bald or the case that Harry is not bald. If Harry is bald, then in the pleonastic sense, it's a fact that Harry is bald. If it's not the case that Harry is bald, then in the pleonastic sense, it's a fact that it's not the case that Harry is bald. So it's either a fact that Harry is bald or a fact that Harry's not bald in this pleonastic sense. But if Harry's a borderline bald person, then Harry is bald is neither determinately true nor determinately false. Now I think not only vagueness, but also the open texturedness of concepts results in semantic indeterminacy. Consider the familiar toy example of Dommel. There are only two meaning postulates for Dommel. The first is a dog is a Dommel. The second is every Dommel is a mammal. These postulates leave it semantically indeterminate whether a cat is a Dommel. In the pleonastic sense of fact, defined by PF and NF, it's either a fact that cats are Dommels or a fact that cats are not Dommels. But cats are Dommels is neither determinately true nor determinately false, given the open textured nature of the concept of a Dommel. So to sum up my preliminary discussion, I'll assume classical logic, that normative claims are true or false, that they express beliefs, and that there are normative facts and properties in a pleonastic sense of fact and property. It is, however, a substantive issue whether normative claims are ever determinately true or determinately false. If normative claims are never determinately true or determinately false, then that's a victory for an interesting kind of neo-non-cognitivism. For reasons I hope to make clear in due course, I reject this kind of neo-non-cognitivism. I think that there are contingent normative claims that have determinate truth values. Now, normative irrealists hold that too. They're error theorists. They hold that positive contingent normative claims are always determinately false. I myself, though, am a normative realist. I think that some positive normative claims are determinately true. I'm also a physicalist. I think that normative realism can be squared with physicalism. But I won't discuss physicalism here. Physicalism implies naturalism, but naturalism doesn't imply physicalism. Intentionality and consciousness are natural phenomena, part of the natural world. One can be a naturalist but reject physicalism on the grounds that intentionality and consciousness are neither physical nor reducible to the physical. It's compatible with naturalism, though not with physicalism, that intentionality and consciousness are fundamental natural phenomena. My brand of naturalism will assume only that intentionality and consciousness are natural phenomena, that they fall on the is side of the ought-is divide. Now, in due course, I'll gesture, and I really just mean gesture, at how I think the thesis that some positive contingent normative claims are determinately true can be squared with naturalism. But I won't speak of natural properties and facts, just of non-normative properties and facts. The reason is that I think it's a conceptual truth, and so a priori, that normative properties depend in a certain way on non-normative properties. But I don't think it's a conceptual truth that normative properties depend in the way in question on natural properties. Natural properties come in this way. In worlds like our world, the only non-normative properties on which normative properties can depend are natural properties. Our world doesn't contain any supernatural ones. I thus take normative properties to depend on non-normative properties, and normative facts to depend on non-normative facts. This position invites the following questions. How are normative properties dependent on non-normative properties? And how are normative facts dependent on non-normative facts? Supervenience has been widely invoked in answer to both questions. The leading idea is that there can't be a normative difference without a non-normative difference. Since I think that fact supervenience can be understood in terms of property supervenience, I'm just going to focus on property supervenience. The core idea is that there can't be a normative difference without the core idea that there can't be a normative difference without a non-normative difference can be explicated in a number of non-equivalent ways. Is the supervenience relation in question strong individual supervenience or weak individual supervenience, and with what sort of necessity, or strong, middling, or weak global supervenience? Which is it? Now, property is used in a broad sense to include relations, and properties are closed under Boolean operations. Then some of these are equivalent. If property is used in a broad sense to include relations, I'll use property in a broad sense to include relations, and since we're working with a pleonastic conception of properties, we'll take properties to be closed under Boolean operations. On this lush pleonastic use of property, if we take property supervenience to be a relation between families of properties closed under Boolean operations, then the claim that the family of normative properties strongly individually supervenes on the family of non-normative properties is equivalent to the claim that the family of normative properties strongly globally supervenes on the family of non-normative properties. Moreover, on this assumption, the possible world formulation of strong individual supervenience is equivalent to the modal operator formulation of strong individual supervenience. So hereafter I'll focus on the modal operator version, which I'll just call strong supervenience. Okay, there's the standard definition of strong individual supervenience. You're all familiar with it, so I won't read it. It's been on the screen a number of times. Notice that a strong supervenience claim contains two occurrences of necessarily. They can be the same or different notions of necessity. So-called weak supervenience is formulated exactly like strong supervenience, except minus the second necessarily. And there it is. only the second necessarily is missing. For reasons that will become clear in due course, I think that no matter what kind of necessity necessarily expresses, weak supervenience is too weak to capture the way in which normative properties are dependent on non-normative properties. Now, a number of theorists have claimed that it's a priori that normative properties strongly supervene on non-normative properties because it's a conceptual truth that normative properties strongly supervene on non-normative properties. I concur with that claim. Let's say that a property is a non-basic property, just in case whenever something has it in virtue of having some other property. And we can say a property is basic just in case it's not non-basic. Most properties are non-basic. Normative properties are among them. Whenever something, say an object or action, has a normative property, it has it in virtue of having a non-normative property. I think that's a conceptual truth, and so a priori. If something has a normative property n and something else lacks n, then there must be some non-normative difference between them in virtue of which the one has n and the other doesn't. The must here seems to me conceptual. Normative concepts function to partition non-normative phenomena, non-normative objects, actions, events, states, properties, facts, etc. This function is required for them to play their action-guiding role. Since in virtue of is a kind of because of, Zangwill has called this the because constraint. Things have whatever normative properties they have because of the non-normative properties that they have. That's, I believe, a conceptual truth. I thus think that the first necessarily in a claim to the effect that the family of non-normative properties strongly supervenes on the family of normative properties strongly supervenes on the family of non-normative properties should express conceptual necessity. Before discussing the second necessarily, the sense in which non-normative subvenient properties necessitate the supervenient normative properties, let me first make some general claims about modality. I think of modality, as do most, though not all contemporary theorists, in terms of possible worlds. I also think, as do most, but again not all contemporary theorists, that the metaphysically possible worlds are literally all of the possible worlds. Metaphysical necessity is truth in every metaphysically possible world, which is just truth in literally every possible world. Metaphysical necessity is thus the modally strongest notion of necessity. I take it that conceptual truths, logical truths, and mathematical truths are all metaphysically necessary truths. A truth can be metaphysically necessary, however, without being a logical truth or a conceptual truth or a mathematical truth. An example is the truth that water is H2O. Saul Kripke demonstrated, using a priori reasoning, the necessity of identity thesis. For any A and B, if A is identical with B, then necessarily A is identical with B. Kripke derived the necessity of identity thesis a priori from two a priori truths. The first is that everything is such that it's necessarily identical with itself. And the second is that if A is identical with B, then whatever is true of A is true of B. Suppose that A is identical with B. Then by the first principle, A is such that it's necessarily identical with A. Given the second principle, B is such that it's necessarily identical with A. So if A is identical with B, then necessarily A is identical with B. That's Kripke's a priori argument for the necessity of identity. Now, Kripke famously explained away apparent counterexamples to the necessity of identity thesis, such as Benjamin Franklin is the inventor of bifocals, by distinguishing the necessity of identity from the claim that all statements of identity are necessary. A statement of identity will be necessary if and only if the terms flanking the identity sign are both rigid designators, that is, designate the same thing in every world. Benjamin Franklin is the inventor of bifocals is a contingent statement of identity. But it isn't contingent because identity is contingent. It's contingent because one of the terms flanking the is of identity is a non-rigid designator, namely the term the inventor of bifocals. Since water and H2O are both rigid designators, water as H2O is non-contingent. It's either necessarily true or necessarily false. On the evidence, it's true. That was an empirical discovery, something we know only a posteriori. But given that it's true, it's necessarily true. So there are necessary truths that are only a posteriori knowable. Since a truth can be metaphysically necessary without being a logical truth, but not conversely, the class of metaphysically necessary truths is a proper subclass of the class of logical truths. But the class of metaphysically possible worlds is not a proper subclass of the class of logically possible worlds. The metaphysically possible worlds are literally all the possible worlds. Now, what remains, the question I want to focus on, is what kind of necessity the second necessarily in the thesis that normative properties strongly supervene on non-normative properties should express if the thesis is to capture the relationship between normative and non-normative properties. The issue is what sort of necessity attaches to supervenience conditionals linking subvenient non-normative properties to supervenient normative properties, conditionals that I'll hereafter call non-normative to normative supervenience conditionals. Fine has argued that there are three main kinds of necessity: metaphysical necessity, natural necessity, and normative necessity. And he's argued that none of them is reducible to the others or to any other kind of necessity. Natural necessity is supposed to be the kind of necessity that natural laws of nature have. Normative necessity is supposed to be the kind of necessity that non-normative to normative supervenience conditionals have. Now, there's a relativized notion of natural necessity that's cheap and trivial. One might hold that P is naturally necessary just in case P holds in every possible world in which our laws of nature hold. A Humean could accept that there's natural necessity in this sense. Notice that in this relativized sense, laws of nature are trivially naturally necessary since they imply themselves. Fine is explicit that this cheap relativized notion of natural necessity is not what he has in mind. By natural necessity, he has in mind a kind of sui generis necessity. Think here of Armstrong's claim that laws are singular relations between universals, such that the instantiation of one of the universals necessitates the instantiation of the other, where the kind of necessitation in question is fundamental, but not metaphysical necessitation. That's the kind of thing he has in mind. Now, I'm skeptical that there is any sui generis kind of natural necessity, but I won't pursue that issue here. For present purposes, suffice it to note that I set the issue aside since I think that even if laws of nature have a sui generis kind of necessity, it's absurd to maintain that non-normative to normative supervenience conditionals are laws of nature. Now, there's a cheap and trivial relativized notion of normative necessity, according to which the non-normative necessitates the normative. One can hold that something's normatively necessary just in case it holds in every possible world in which the non-normative to normative supervenience conditionals of our world hold. Those supervenience conditionals are trivially normatively necessary in this sense, since they entail themselves. Indeed, the weak supervenience of the normative on the non-normative will entail the strong supervenience of the normative on the non-normative if the second necessarily in the strong supervenience thesis is just this cheap, trivialized, relativized notion of normative necessity. Again, because the supervenience conditionals imply themselves. Now, Fine is explicit that by normative necessity, he does not have in mind this cheap, relativized notion. He maintains that normative necessity is a fundamental, sui generis kind of necessity. Tim Scanlon, in his John Locke lectures, has joined Fine in this claim, embracing a kind of fundamental, sui generis notion of necessity. Let me simply note that I find the notion of a sui generis kind of normative necessity mysterious. I maintain that it's metaphysically necessary, because it's a conceptual truth, that for each x and each property f in the family of normative properties, if x has f, then there's a property g in the family of non-normative properties, such that x has g, and it's metaphysically necessary that if any y has g, it has f. Fine rejects this on the following grounds. The second necessity can't be metaphysical necessity because it can't be explained in terms of the identity of things, he says, even in a broad sense of that expression. Metaphysical necessities, he maintains, must be explainable in terms of the identity of things, in his broad sense. Fine acknowledges that if normative properties are identical with non-normative properties, there will trivially be metaphysical necessitation in both directions. But he denies that normative properties are identical with non-normative properties. Now, a claim to the effect that a certain normative property is a certain non-normative property would no doubt be puzzling, at least at first blush. How can a non-normative property be a normative property? How can a non-F property be an F property? Well, a property identity theorist might answer that a property is only normative or non-normative under a conceptualization, that is, under a concept. A given property can be normative under one concept and non-normative under another. But having noted that, let me just say that I won't maintain that normative properties are identical with non-normative properties. I think that the metaphysical necessity of non-normative to normative supervenience conditionals can be explained otherwise than in terms of the identity of things. Before elaborating, however, I want to first point out that even if, as I hold, it's a conceptual truth that normative properties strongly supervene with metaphysical necessity on non-normative properties, it doesn't follow from that contingent normative claims are sometimes either determinately true or determinately false. Given that the supervenience thesis is a conceptual truth, the supervenience thesis itself is determinately true, since all conceptual truths are determinately true. but it doesn't follow that the supervenience conditionals are determinately true. The reason, in a nutshell, is that modal claims can fail to be determinately true or determinately false. We can see this by appeal to the least controversial cases of failure of determinate truth and determinate falsehood, the cases involving borderline cases. Suppose, to grossly oversimplify, that it's a conceptual truth that whether someone is bald strongly supervenes with metaphysical necessity on the number and configuration of hairs on the person's scalp. That is, suppose the following. That's just the strong supervenience thesis. I would say n can be 0, of course, and we can talk about the null configuration of scalp hairs for individuals that don't have any scalp hairs. Now, if that strong supervenience thesis is indeed a conceptual truth, then it's determinately true. But it's compatible with its being determinately true that there are cases in which it's indeterminate whether someone with n hairs in C is bald. Indeed, that's exactly what we find in borderline cases of baldness. Thus, suppose that Harry is a borderline bald person. It's determinately true that Harry will have some number and configuration of scalp hairs, even if the number is 0 and the configuration is the null configuration. So let n be the number of scalp hairs Harry has and C be their configuration. Given the supervenience thesis, a determinate truth, if Harry is bald, then it's metaphysically necessary that anyone with n and C is bald. And given the supervenience thesis, if Harry is not bald, then it's metaphysically necessary that anyone with n and C is not bald. It's determinately true that Harry is either bald or not bald. It follows from these claims that it's determinately true that either it's metaphysically necessary that anyone with n hairs, n and C is bald, or it's metaphysically necessary that anyone with n and C is not bald. But that's compatible with neither disjunct being determinately true. And indeed, if Harry's a borderline bald person, then neither disjunct will be determinately true. The determinately operator, you will recall, doesn't commute with disjunction. It's determinately true that it's either metaphysically necessary that anyone with n and C is bald, or metaphysically necessary that anyone with n and C is not bald. But it's indeterminate whether it's metaphysically necessary that anyone with n and C is bald. N and C, right, of the number configuration on Harry's head is a borderline bald person. And it's indeterminate whether it's metaphysically necessary that anyone with n and C is not bald. Of course, many claims of the form, it's metaphysically necessary that anyone with n and C is bald, and many conditionals of the form, it's metaphysically necessary that anyone with n and C is not bald, will be determinately true. But the example nevertheless shows that it's possible for it to be conceptually necessary that a family of properties strongly supervenes with metaphysical necessity on another family of properties, yet it be semantically indeterminate whether the metaphysical necessitation relations hold. Or in what direction they hold, I should say. Supervenience with metaphysical necessity is compatible with semantic indeterminacy. It's thus open to neo-non-cognitivists to acknowledge that it's a conceptual truth that normative properties strongly supervene with metaphysical necessity on non-normative properties. For the neo-non-cognitivists can also maintain that the non-normative to normative supervenience conditionals are never determinately true or determinately false. Now, because of vagueness, there is, I think, no question that some non-normative to normative supervenience conditionals will be neither determinately true nor determinately false. And it may well also be the case that some fail to be determinately true or determinately false because of the open texturedness of the relevant concepts. I think Gerald was trying to flesh out cases like these. But I maintain that many of the non-normative to normative conditionals will be determinately true. That is to say, many of the non-normative to normative conditionals will be metaphysically necessary determinant truths. The reason I maintain is that normative properties are determinables of certain non-normative properties, the ones that are their supervenience-based properties, and so that certain non-normative properties are determinants of normative properties. Think of the kind of necessity, the kind of necessity that attaches to non-normative to normative supervenience conditionals is the same kind of necessity that attaches to if something's maroon, then it's red, and if something's red, then it's colored. The kind of necessity in question is metaphysical necessity, truth in literally every possible world. Being maroon is a way of being red is a way of being colored. I'm now at this point where you should take anything I say with a, with a lot of skepticism. In general, if property F is a determinant of property G, and so G is a determinable of F, then being F is a way of being G. The non-normative supervenience properties, supervenience-based properties, will be ways of having the supervenient normative properties. That's why something will have the normative properties in virtue of or because of having the non-normative property. So what I'm maintaining is that having a certain non-normative property can be a way of having a certain normative property. Moreover, one can in principle see that that is the case a priori, just as in the case of maroon and red and colored. Keep in mind, though, that the a priority in question is in principle a priority. It may take a priori reasoning to see that a non-normative to normative supervenience conditional is true. Think of the claim that mathematical truths are a priori. They can be anything but obvious, but they're in principle a priori knowable. So I'm thinking the epistemology of this is going to be analogous to the epistemology of mathematics, a claim that a number of people have made, I've noticed. A knife will be a good carving knife, that is, good to serve the purpose of carving certain material, in virtue of having certain non-normative properties, such as being sharp, rigid enough to cut the material in question, easy to hold, etc. Having those natural properties is a way of being a good carving knife. Consider thick normative characterizations of actions, such as murder, which I'll just take to be unjustified killing, cruelty, reprehensible, irresponsible, feckless, inconsiderate, courageous, benevolent, justified, unjustified, and so on and so forth. These are evaluative and so normative characterizations of actions. They are, I maintain, determinables of non-normative determinants. I'll illustrate this with one example. Killing someone in a certain naturalistic way W, in naturalistic circumstances C, will, here I'll use the count as relation, count as unjustifiably killing the person, and so as murder. Thus, A can murder B by killing B in way W in circumstance C. The by relation here is the constitutive by means of relation. Killing someone in way W in circumstance C is a way of murdering the person. The first stands to the second as determinant to determinable. Consider a basic, some would claim the basic normative notion, the notion of being a reason for. The fact that the edge of the razor is sharp is a reason for a certain kind of agent, A, one with certain mental and physical states, in a certain circumstance, C, not to run his or her finger across it. I claim that being a fact that the edge of the razor is sharp is a way of being a reason for an agent of kind A and C not to run his or her fingers across it. One stance or the other is determinable to determinate to determinable. Now the fact, if it is one, that non-normative subvenient properties are related to the supervenient normative properties as determinants to determinables would explain why the non-normative to normative supervenience conditionals are typically metaphysically necessary and determinately true. This is a robust normative realism. It makes no appeal to the idea that normative properties are identical with non-normative properties. So I don't explain the metaphysical necessity in terms of identity. But it will be compatible with naturalism if, as I maintain, but of course lack the time to properly argue for here, the non-normative properties that normative properties strongly supervene with metaphysical necessity on can be natural properties. Okay, that's it. So my fear is that somebody said in the literature that the relationship is determinable determinate, and there are knockdown counterexamples to that in the literature. I don't know this stuff.
Not really a question, but it seems to me you suggested that if you have these metaphysically necessary conditionals, that suffices to say that there is therefore in virtue of the antecedent that the consequent are true.
Actually, the reverse of that. I mean, I don't think metaphysical necessitation will guarantee an in virtue of relation, because the in virtue of because anything metaphysically necessitates itself, but the in virtue of relation is asymmetrical. Rather, I was appealing to the in virtue of relation to suggest that there's metaphysical necessitation. So the reverse.
Thank you, Brian. I think very interesting. I have a question. I have an example for you. Is when you have the determinacy of the obligations is depends on definite descriptions.
Depends on what?
Definite descriptions. Suppose Nino is the first homeless you meet in 2014, right?
Right.
And you have the obligation to give $10 to the first homeless you meet in 2014, right? You have the obligation to give $10. The question for you is, you are obliged to give $10 to me. Okay, this is a question of is very puzzled in the literature, and
yeah,
what we say is indeterminate, right?
Depends on, I guess it. Well, I mean, here would be the traditional way of putting the issue, I guess. I don't know the literature on ought, but it depends on whether ought creates an intentional with an S context. It looks like it does. So it looks like substitutivity of identicals will fail.
Exactly. So, in fact, that's the reason why I raised the question, because this is the indeterminacy of that obligation depends on the fact that you have rigidity of terms, the fact that you may have words where some individuals don't exist, depends on the fact that the same individual can have different names in different worlds, right? So here the indeterminacy depends precisely on the fact that you have this rigidity, right, of the terms. But you mentioned that as something that doesn't play any role in your picture, as far as I understood, right?
No,
You
I
said-
don't
you
think I
said
did.
you don't-
The only thing I thought, the only time I brought in rigidity is to point out that even though identity is necessary, that all statements of identity are necessary, because a statement of identity can fail to be necessary despite the fact that identity is necessary if one of the terms flanking the identity sign is not a rigid designator. That's the only time I think I brought it in.
Yeah. But it's not clear to me how you can accommodate my example in your perspective. That's something I don't understand.
Which part of the perspective?
Um,
You don't mean the necessity of identity?
exactly.
Oh, you mean the necessity of identity?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so Cicero is the person who blah, 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 and that's not a rigid designator,
Yeah.
right? So that's a contingent statement of identity.
Right.
You can make it a necessary statement of identity if rigidify the description. Cicero is the actual person, or Cicero is the person who's in fact. You can make it rigid then it would be a necessary statement of identity.
I see. Okay.
So I'm trying to figure out what kind of normative realism you're defending in particular, right? I had in mind because you do claim something really strong in terms of supervenience, right? You want it to be conceptual a priori and of a specific kind.
Right, so the supervenience itself is a conceptual truth, and then Ernie look forward. And then the second necessarily is metaphysical necessity. But again, that's compatible with a kind of neo-non-cognitivism. So one of the points I was making is somebody can hold that very strong thesis, but say, but these supervenience conditionals are never determinately true or determinately false. They're all indeterminate.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can even grant that claim that sounds very strong that I'm making, but be a neo-non-cognitivist. But I wanted to say that they are sometimes determinately true, and the explanation of why they are sometimes determinately true and metaphysically necessary, we explain both, is that normative properties are related to non-normative properties as determinables to determinants.
Yes.
That's a very strong claim, but it's not identity, so I'm not going to
No, yes.
appeal to
So-
the identity.
No,
thing.
but I think there are, even though I wouldn't call it realism, I think there are several, sub-claims of what you're defending here that are compatible with what I call, constructivism. So the reason why the question I want to raise is whether you are really committed to the view that what you need in order to vindicate this sort of normative supervenience is realism.
Well, I don't want metaphysical. I don't want normative necessity. I want sui generis notion normative. I want metaphysical. But whether it looks to me like my account is compatible with a constructivist account.
Yes.
So that would be a substantive issue. I'm not clear about that issue because I haven't thought much about this stuff, but it may be compatible with a kind of constructivism. I'm kind of inclined away from constructivism because I'm sort of attracted, maybe just because I've read so little and the few people I've read influence me, but I'm kind of attracted towards the view that maybe the fundamental normative relation is the reason for relation. And there it doesn't look to me like it's constructivist. Now, even if this view, one question is whether this view I have, as strong as it is, really counts as normative realism in the sense of realism some people have in mind. There are also reasons for somebody might have for thinking it's not an adequate account, because it doesn't, I haven't said anything about how it connects up with motivation. So, I mean, I can get normative moral realism in the same sense of realism that I get for the normative, but I read some quotes in Zangwill from Christine Korsgaard where she said, moral realism can't answer the question of why we ought to be moral, why the moral has any authority on it. And she said, and they refused to answer it. So when I read that, I thought, well, let me think of moral realism in the sense that I'm espousing. I thought it's true that my moral realism doesn't answer that question. And I think that question has a real point and deserves an answer. Why ought I be moral? But it doesn't seem to me that I have to refuse to answer it. It's just that my moral realism won't answer it. Somebody might grant that they have a reason for doing something, moral reason for doing something, but not be moved to do it at all. So you have to answer that normative question with a normative answer. But again, the point is that the moral realist, in my sense, doesn't refuse to answer the question. It's just that their moral realism doesn't answer the question. I think that's a real question. It's a very tough question to answer. If you do get down to a fundamental, if it is the case, though, that the really fundamental moral notion, this is something I got from Scanlon, and Laura was suggesting this. I only read, Scanlon's one of the few things I read it a week ago, because I wrote to somebody and said, oh, he's got something on supervenience. So he sent me his book manuscript, so I just skimmed it quickly. But he was maintaining that the fundamental normative relation is the reason for relation. And when he asked the question seems to me, when you're not talking about morality, to make less sense. So it would make a lot of sense to say, why ought I act for reasons when you can't intentionally act without acting for reasons? And there's something self-defeating about asking, give me a reason for believing I should believe for reasons. Something really odd about that question. In a way, the question, why should I be morals, doesn't strike me as odd. It sounds like it's a kind of pressing question. But, so I haven't much to say about normativity. So the question is, does my view deserve to be called moral realism in every sense of realism that people have in mind? And then there are further issues, which I really brought up that you didn't bring up, about whether it's an adequate theory of normativity, because you might think an adequate theory of normativity ought to explain why the normative should motivate us, and mine doesn't.
No, I think what you're doing, especially in relation to Scanlon or David Enoch, as I was discussing yesterday, you're discussing a fundamental relation that is normative insofar as it takes a reason relation as basic, right? They're primitives as
takes what as basic?
The reason relation as basic. So what counts as a reason
I'm
is
sympathetic. I'm not committed to that view, but I'm sort of sympathetic to that view. Although I think that's going to strongly supervene metaphysical necessity in the non-normative, because you're just going to get it being a fact that the edge of the razor is sharp.
But that doesn't
counts as being a reason for. Yeah.
Yes, so that's the part in which your theory may align with Scanlon and other moral realists, but that doesn't exclude that what we call obligations, for example, or moral obligation, or the obligatoriness of obligations allow for a constructivist reading. This is compatible with Scanlon too. I mean, Scanlon is a constructivist about political obligations.
I just want to say, my view actually is not compatible with Scanlon's view, because Scanlon follows fine in saying that there's a sui generis kind of normative necessity.
Yes, that's
and that's what I'm denying. So actually my overall view is I'm without having thought about it much, it seems plausible to me that the reason for relation might be the basic normative relation.
Yeah,
but my view is not compatible with his view, because I don't think there's a sui generis kind of normative necessity.
But then I think then you're facing another dilemma, right? Because either you think that the reason relation is basic and primitive and I think that part of Scanlon is something you want to save, because it is what makes you a realist, right?
Yeah,
so.
exactly.
I mean, the part that is a basic relation, you want to keep it, right? Otherwise, what makes you a realist? I mean,
it's that I think the reason for relation, the conceptually necessary truth of the reason for relation supervenes with metaphysical necessity on non-normative properties.
Yes, but this is not much different from any other normative realist. What you want to reject is the view that this is a sui generis relation.
Yeah.
Right? So I think, the dilemma that we discussed yesterday resurfaced for you. I mean, the fact that it's a strong kind of supervenience and they're not identical. I think at some point you do have to explain why, Jackson.
I'm not explaining it by appeal to identity. I'm explaining it by appeal to the determinable-determinant relation. So I'm saying the determinable determinant relation cases, you get metaphysical necessity, but it's not in virtue of identity. So that's how it's different from. So in a way, I'm saying, you know, unless you, I don't know. He says in a broad sense of the identity of things. That depends on how broad he makes the sense. He might make it broad enough that it includes the determinable determinant, and then I would say, well, you can get that with the normative. But if you think of the clear cases where something like property identity, then that I deny, but I also deny that that's the only way to explain metaphysical necessity.
Whether a particular action's right or wrong are compatible with the
Yes,
supervenience.
being semantically indeterminate whether an action's right or wrong is compatible with strong
Yes,
supervenience.
yes,
Right?
I think that's right. But what I was thinking is of cases where it's not indeterminate in that way. It's just indeterminate whether an action's right or wrong, because in some possible worlds it's right, and exactly the same action in another possible world is wrong, but due to different features.
Yeah, I'm not thinking of it that, not that kind of case. I guess I'm
Yeah.
rejecting that. Yeah.
Yes. Why are you rejecting that? Why would that not secure the kind of because that Zangwill was talking about?
I just don't find that plausible. I mean, I do find the kind of cases you had in mind when you said, look, an action's right in so far as it's saving a life, it's wrong in so far as it's a killing, but maybe it has other properties, and we try to take into account all the variances. It's unclear whether it passes the threshold for being right or is below the threshold for being right and so counts as wrong. Maybe there's a kind of open texturedness too, so there's a kind of indeterminacy there. I find, well, that plausible. That would give you semantic indeterminacy. So it may be, in some cases, just semantically indeterminate whether it's right or wrong. But the idea that, you know, the very same action, circumstances the same, is right in some world, wrong in other worlds, that I don't find plausible.
So you would reject the idea that you could have this sort of indeterministic causation between natural properties and the normative properties?
It depends on what you mean. If you mean by so you don't mean efficient causation, you mean something like what Ted Sider calls metaphysical causation, where he understands metaphysical causation in terms of the in virtue of a grounding, which the only way I can understand grounding is in terms of the in virtue of relation. No, I think you can get it. You're going to get it with semantic indeterminacy. So it's indeterminate whether because of that it has n, or because of that it doesn't have n.
Yeah, okay, I need to think more.
I mean, there could be this difference. There could be this difference. So there's this difference. So take regular efficient causation. So causation, you know, in efficient causation sense is indeterministic. So C doesn't causally determine E, but C causes E, right? But it might not have caused E. It might have been followed by E prime, right? And so not by E. You can get that. What I don't think is there's a difference with the grounding relation of metaphysical causation, because it's not that it's not just when it doesn't determine that it's P rather than not P, then it's just indeterminate whether it's P rather than not P. Rather than it's not determining that it's P, but it happens to be P, which is what you were assuming. So that's one way I think the analogy between efficient causation and metaphysical causation breaks down.
So you would say efficient causation?
I would say really it just is indeterminate then. Right. Whereas it's not indeterminate what the effect was with causal. I mean, it happened to be E. It could have been E star, but it happened to be E. But I don't think you get that feature with metaphysical causation. I think it's if it doesn't determine it, then it's indeterminate.
Couldn't efficient causation? Why won't efficient causation give one grounding? Why couldn't we say, well, this feature efficiently caused this moral property, and therefore it's in virtue?
Because I guess I don't think of the relationship between non-normative properties and normative properties as being causal. I mean, I think that certain non-normative properties may cause instances of other non-normative properties, but then whether you get a normative property depends on, the vertical, the grounding relation, not on causation.
Yes, I suppose I do think that it's causal, and then that seems to me to
I mean,
develop-
that could count as causal. It'd be something like Kim's supervenient causation. So I think it would count as causal, but what's key is whether or not the non-normative efficient causal effect is a ground for the normative property. So I don't mean that, so it's consistent with this that, normative properties can enter into causal relations, but in a kind of derivative way. But the key relation is the grounding relation, not the efficient causal relation.
But I could be efficiently caused to favour something by certain of its features, but it could have been indeterministic whether those features would cause me to favour it.
Right.
But then we'd still say it's true that I favour drinking that because it has these features.
Actually, no. I think it could. I think it could cause you to favor it because you might favor it just by wanting it, so it could cause you to want it in a straightforward sense.
Yeah. But then wouldn't we say my favourite?
But whether you have a reason for having it, that's going to involve the grounding relation.
But if I favoured drinking a certain drink because certain features of it have caused me to want to drink it.
That's true. Yeah.
And it was indeterministic whether they would, because I was sort of a bit torn between.
That's true too.
But then we'd say I wanted to drink it because of it had those features.
Yeah.
So I
I
came
don't
to.
think the causal because is.
Because I suppose on my view, I
don't think that the causal because requires causation to be deterministic. Yeah. But I think the inverture, the grounding relation is different. Not that it can't, it's not different in this sense. It's not that it can't allow indeterminacy. It's just that when it doesn't determine, it's just indeterminate.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I accept.
Yeah.
I accept the possibility of those kinds of
Right.
indeterminate. I think that's
Right.
fine. I'm just thinking about how to, if you want to accommodate the normativity, the favouring relation, then it seems to me I'm just drawing an analogy with me as someone who is in the favouring and disfavouring business, and I can favour drinking something because that thing has certain features, and it can have been indeterministic whether those features caused me to favour drinking it.
I agree with that. Yeah, I'm not denying that.
And then it would be true to say I favoured drinking it because of those features. Couldn't we say the same about reasons?
Well, that's why I keep saying no, but
Yeah.
yeah.
So it does
But,
seem-
I think there's a disanalogy there. But I agree with the thing you said. It's possible. I agree with. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, thanks.
It's like people used to wonder what's the difference between underdetermination and indeterminacy. And a situation like this, it could be the cause could kind of underdetermine the effect, but you get not just underdetermination but indeterminacy if the grounding relation doesn't affect.
Yes, about the determinable determinate relation. So if you have a knife with a sharp blade, etc., you have a good knife. It's a way of, I mean, the knife is a way of being a good knife. But how do you make the difference between good and bad? So if you have a knife with a blunt edge, etc., is a bad knife. How do you where does the difference between good and bad come from?
Well, in that case, it just really depends on our interests, right? But so the normative properties are going to be a kind of mixed bag. So the interesting questions is whether the moral cases or the basic cases like reason for depend on your interest. But there it just depends on your interest.
Because you have, like being having a sharp edge, it's supposed to be completely non-normative. So if it's non-normative,
Right, that's right, that's not normative. So that might be a good making feature relative to certain purposes you have, but a bad making feature relative to other purposes you have. Like if you're just practicing dueling, you want to do it with a very sharp knife, which might accidentally cut the person. So.
is there something normative in our purposes?
Well, that normativity in those cases, like with the knife, is just explained in terms of our purposes. Yeah, good for the purpose of carving meat, say. Bad for the purpose of practicing dueling, given your interests.
The subject. You could also just hold that good and bad are attributive adjective, as Judith Thompson suggests. So, and she holds that, for example, a knife is a kind of thing which is, as she says, goodness fixing. So you something maybe good as a knife or a good knife, without being a good thing. So that's another way of.
Yeah. I mean, the knife case is the easiest case for me, right? So I didn't bring that up as looking really illuminating, but just to explain the idea I want and try to see if that extends to the other cases. But take something like Kim had a discussion of Saint Francis. Maybe you got this from Hare. I have read Hare, but that was a long time ago. Whether Saint Francis is a good man, and say, well, Saint Francis is a good man. Why? He was a good man in virtue of the fact that he was honest, courageous, compassionate. Maybe he had some other features. And you say, those are ways of being a good man, having those features. But those features are normative. So maybe in the appropriate way of understanding courage, it's a virtue. Especially if you have a kind of golden mean notion of courage, right? Where you distinguish being courage from being reckless. It's a virtue. And, being compassionate, it's a virtue, and so on. So they're normative notions themselves. But my idea was that you then take those normative notions and go down further. Well, in virtue of having the following mental and behavioral dispositions, he counts as being honest, or he counts as being compassionate. That having those mental and behavioral dispositions, where the mental dispositions include not only disposition to think certain things, but dispositions to reason in certain ways, to take certain considerations into account, to have certain feelings. If he has those dispositions, and that's all on the is side, that's just a way of being compassionate or honest or having the virtue. So as you go down, then you will get the normative qualities supervening on the non-normative qualities.
Any other questions? Okay, perhaps I have time for a short one. At one point, you said you were going to use the word properties to designate pleonastic properties. But now I have the feeling that at the end of your talk, it was no longer in this sense that you were talking of properties.
No, actually I do, even at the end of the talk, I really want that to be a pleonastic notion of properties, because I actually do have views about properties. But if you ask me what I really think properties are, none of these things are, there aren't any normative properties, but there aren't any of the natural properties I was talking about either. That's all just concepts. I mean, if you ask me, what I have in mind by myself, if I was going to push the notion of property, I think they're eminent Aristotelian universals, and there's just a small number of them. But then it turns out that, in that sense, most of the special sciences predicates don't denote properties in that sense that I think of. So I actually like Shoemaker's causal theory of properties, and then but I'm more restrictive than he is about which properties really endow things with causal powers. But as he himself knows, he needs other notions of properties. So he'll talk about a property having forward-looking and backward-looking causal features. Well, those features are themselves properties, but the causal theory of properties doesn't apply to them. Well, I wouldn't think of those as properties. I think of those as concepts.
I think it's important to the issue of realism, because I think that most model realists have a very strong conception of a substantive conception of moral properties.
Yeah, so I myself don't in fact have that, but I don't take that to be irrealist. I think it's a mistake to think you need that for realism for determinate truth. You don't need that for determinate truth. So I think they're mistaken in thinking you need such a strong notion. And as I said, in the really strong sense, you know, I don't think they're biological properties. Yeah.
I guess that's my worry should be if you have a such a big conception of properties, then again I don't understand what makes you a realist in the practical realist domain.
This might be helpful. My view about properties my view here doesn't depend on my view about properties. So you can say, no, they really are properties. The word property gets used in many different ways. It's used to serve different purposes. So, you know, it's compatible with everything I say here that you read property in a strong sense. So then, I mean, suppose you think, you know, you really need a property to have a fact, right? Well, then what do you mean by facts? If you mean fact of P if and only of P, you're trivially going to get that. If you have stronger notions in mind, then I'd have to see whether there are properties in that sense. Like Jaegwon Kim has a view that that in the special sciences, virtually none of the predicates denote properties. They express functional concepts. And he thinks there are no functional properties. There are no such things as functional properties. And Shoemaker thinks that too. Shoemaker thinks there's no such thing as the functional concepts, but there's no such thing as a functional property. And I know why they say that, and there are good reasons for saying that if you want properties to serve a certain theoretical point. But once you give up then that they're functional properties, then you know, that doesn't make you a realist about whenever we use functional discourse.
But that could be a difference between you know the debate as it is being constructed around moral supervenience and practical supervenience and the other domain. Because in the moral domain, it is very important if you are defending a strong or a weak conception of property. And the fact that, I mean, what you defend about property is something that I would endorse, although I would not endorse.
I have to look at why they do it, so I don't know the literature. I suspect though there's more than one notion of property in play, and they want properties to do certain jobs that maybe pleonastic properties can do. So I'd have to actually look at the literature. So what would they give as an example of a clear-cut case where there's a meaningful predicate that doesn't have a property? So you might want to say, look, here's a clear case where we have a meaningful predicate, it doesn't denote a property. And you see normative predicates are like that. So what would be an example of a clear-cut case that doesn't denote a property?
I think the difference between realist and constructivist, even the non-cognitivist time, wouldn't be that one. I mean, the constructivists do think there are normative properties.
Right.
They do not think these normative properties stand for grounding relations. So
right, but some people you were saying, look, say you don't really have moral realism unless you really have moral properties, right? And so then they acknowledge, I assume, that moral predicates are meaningful. So they must think a predicate can be meaningful without denoting a property. Okay, so do they have any non-question begging examples of that? And then I can see what notion of property they have in mind. So you might say, well, you see this predicate, clearly a meaningful predicate, but we all agree that doesn't denote a property. Well, see, the moral predicates are like that. They're meaningful, but they don't denote properties, and that's why I'm a moral realist. But what are their clear-cut, non-question begging examples of meaningful predicates that don't denote properties? Because if you can give me that, then I'll give an idea of what conception of property they're working with and see whether I agree with them or not.
So, for example, Banksy starts with the idea of wrongness.
Well, that's a question-begging one. Let's give me one that has nothing to do with morality. So moral predicates are the only meaningful predicates that don't denote properties? Is that the view? The only ones that don't denote them are the moral ones or the normative ones. I think, well, why is that? What notion of property do they have in mind? But they don't give any, like, here's a clear-cut case we can all agree about and say, it's really like that. They don't have any, like, non-question begging, clear-cut cases of meaningful predicates that don't denote properties in their sense of property. Do they have any? I don't know the literature, so. I mean, I'd want to see that if they insisted on that. Then I'd try to get an idea what they had in mind by a property.
I think what they're trying to do is to explain a relation, and they explain a relation by indicating some natural property. So, what's wrong? I mean, killing for fun is wrong. That's a fact. You can explain a fact in terms of properties, and
Yeah, I see what they mean by property. I mean, what goes on a lot is this is what some people, not me because I've done it, but hate about analytical metaphysics, because people use these pleonastic notions and they act then like they're saying really substantive things, and they're not. It's just what Schiffer calls cheap metaphysics. Stolnaker hates that about analytical metaphysics, but I don't hate analytical metaphysics.
We're right on time. Thank you,
You're welcome.